do you feel a moral imperative to keeping Shylock on tenterhooks as a character? Do you think, I mean, must he be permanently problematized no matter how we come at it in order to, I guess, sort of honor history in a sense?
Could I use maybe a modern analogy to Shakespeare?
Please.
I saw, and if I actually wanted to bring the quote, apologies. I happened to see this, and in preparing for this, I found this fascinating. Listen to this quote. "The Jews, I find, are very, very selfish. When they have power, physical, financial, or political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment to the underdog." Who do you think is the author of that statement? Harry S. Truman.
Wow.
Michael Beschloss, when he went to Independence, Missouri, was doing, he's a preeminent presidential historian. He found this in the Truman Diaries. Now, we know for a fact that if it weren't for Harry Truman sticking his neck out, being threatened, the threat of humiliation by his own Secretary of State, we know that his own cabinet was against it. There would be no state of Israel. The Jewish people, after the Holocaust, could have assimilated out and been lost. What happened? Eddie Jacobson, right, who he went into business with, an old friend in the haberdashery business, they went bankrupt. It was a function of the Great Depression. How many people keep a relationship with a former business partner who their business failed? So Harry Truman doesn't have to prove himself as someone who risked his neck and stood out for the Jews. But the reality is, Harry Truman is a product of his world. It was an anti-Semitic America at that time. It's an anti-Semitic culture. And Harry Truman is not any more anti-Jewish than anyone else. This is just the context of where he's coming from. I have no right to project myself or to speculate as to what was going on in William Shakespeare's mind. But the reality is, if he lived in the England that we all know existed at that time, and if the perception of a Christian European was of what a typical Christian European would see a Jew at that time in history, Shylock doesn't seem to be that far afield. It's not a statement of is whether Shakespeare was an anti-Semite or not an anti-Semite. It's a statement about what the world Shakespeare lived in and what was, so to speak, what was the milieu that he was functioning from.
And that brings us to the forced baptism in Dan Sullivan's production, which was the coup de théâtre and the sort of great moment of insight that
Let's
the
talk
director
about that. I mean, was there much discussion? Did Dan bring that to
It was Dan's
you
idea
fellows?
really early on, and I remember a conversation with Oscar Eustis, who's the artistic director of the Public. He said to me, "How's it going?" I said, "Well, Dan's got this idea." At the end of the trial scene, Antonio says, "I'll let him go, but he has to become a Christian." And that's the terrible, horrible moment where they...
And I should interject to justify this added scene, and I would love 5 added scenes with Pacino, but that's another question. In all the sources Shakespeare's drawing on in writing the story, there's not in any single one of them mention of the forced conversion of the Jews. That is Shakespeare's addition to the plot. And that's significant. And that, in a way, to me, justifies playing out what you're going to describe.
So Sullivan said, well, they say they're going to do it. Let's see it. Let's see what it looks like when they actually do it. And so there was a scene in which a bunch of big thugs came and grabbed Shylock, and there was a pool on stage. A door opened up and revealed a pool, and forcibly dunked,
in front of a priest.
In front of a priest was there who blessed it.
And none of the Jews got that, by the way. I had friends who sat, they didn't attend your school, and they didn't understand. What's he doing in the war? I'm serious.
And it was, I remember really distinctly going to Oscar Eustis and saying, well, it's either going to be a stroke of genius or the worst idea any of us...
or bring in a personal dimension here, and if you could go back in time a little bit for us about when you first came across the character of Shylock as a student or a reader or even a theater goer, what you made of the character when you, if you can recall, when you sort of first heard about him or came across him.
I would say this, after being exposed to Barrie, and Barrie showing, not only in Shylock, but in all of Shakespeare's characters, how he portrays the nuance, the subtleties, how in the interaction of the various characters you see nuance and subtleties. That's what made Shylock fascinating. What also made it fascinating, and again, I'm contrasting that to having read it as a child, as an adolescent. Shakespeare had not been to Venice. He probably didn't get a chance to see how the Jews dressed, as Barrie mentioned, in Venice, the role that they played in terms of international trade. He didn't experience that firsthand, but yet that he could convey, a certain subtlety and nuance in who Shylock was. The British at that time knew the role that the medieval Jew played and the post-medieval Jew played in terms of the commerce, not only of Britain, but of all of Europe, and the crucial role they played in terms of the economy of Christian Europe. But the fact that he hadn't, even though he may have met converso Jews, he never met that Jew that he portrayed or that he created in Shylock. I found that to be brilliant. As an adolescent when I read it, it was black and white. As a Jew, I was defensive. As a Jew, I recoiled. Seeing it through the eyes of Al Pacino, really seeing it through the eyes of what Barrie presented, first, in the park, then in the theater, it was a different Shylock, and it gave all of us, I think, a greater appreciation for the brilliance and the depth of William Shakespeare.
Yeah. It's interesting. I sometimes wonder if when we're kids or we're teenagers and we come across these characters at first, if we have in a way more pure and visceral reaction. Horror is almost easier to access, and yet as we grow older, somehow we begin to see sort of the nuances and the subtleties, but it almost, to me, I had a moment in the park with Al Shylock where I found myself, I felt like understanding too much, and I felt like I was getting a little distanced from the horror. It had nothing to do with his performance. It had to do entirely with my own reaction and how much sort of thinking was going on and not so much feeling. And that's sort of why I was sort of curious with, for you, Robert Wilde.
As a kid, you see, the Jew is interested in justice, in the pound of flesh. Yeah. With a Christian, it's about love. It's about mercy and compassion. But then when you see it as an adult, you realize the Christians who are standing for mercy and compassion, bottom line is when the trial turns, there's no mercy and compassion, there's no love for Shylock. As a kid, when you see that, how can they do that? How they portray the Jews this way? With Shakespeare, an anti-Semite, when you see it as an adult, it's not so clear.
The Merchant of Venice was the third Shakespeare play that I read, and I was a sophomore at a Catholic Jesuit high school in South Boston, Massachusetts, and it was 1986, and I remember I had a very sheltered sort of suburban childhood, and then they sent me to the priests, which was interesting. But it was striking because what we heard a great deal in high school then, it was second term of Reagan, was how important Israel was. I didn't know much about Israel from beyond going to church every week, but we were told that Israel was our most important ally of all the countries. I remember in social studies when the teacher asked us freshman year, who was the United States' most important ally? And we all were sort of guessing, Britain, and they said, no, it's Israel. And it was sort of an awakening. But then the following year, reading the play in class, just the horror of coming across an idea like a pound of flesh. At first, a lot of us didn't believe it was sort of literally what they were saying, but in fact, it was so. And I remember at the time, we as a class struggled quite a bit with who Shakespeare was, and if he was writing about real people, or if he was writing from an animus within. And I know, Jim, this is a question that has affected scholars for many years. Could you set a frame for us on that from your point of view?
Sure. I would love to be able to tell you what Shakespeare thought about anything, about his wife, about his kids, about how he was doing, about his rivals, about what his next play was. The truth is, anybody who tells you, whether they're wearing a tweed jacket or not, that they know what Shakespeare felt about anything is misrepresenting what scholars actually know. So we're really stuck reconstructing what was known. And all I can tell you is Shakespeare was interested in Jewish questions. And almost every major writer of the day was interested in Jewish questions.